Just start the interview. So will you please lead off?
Okay, my name is Robert Frase. I was born on January 1, 1912, in the city of Chicago, where my parents ran a retail bakery on the far southwest side of the city. My father was born in Germany and came to this country at the age of 16, preceded by an older brother who got into working in a bakery in Chicago, and he then brought over his other brothers who started working in the bakery, and 4 of them ended up running retail bakeries in the city of Chicago. He never went beyond school beyond the age of 16. My mother was a second generation American. Her mother and father had come over. They were Welsh and English. And they had come over at the age of 14 in school. Was working in the bakery in the front parts selling, where my father was a baker in the back part of the bakery. So they were married in 1903 and set up their own bakery business.
Sounds like the typical start of a family business.
That's right. And I had an older brother, 8 years older than I, and in some ways I was kind of an only child, because he went off after high school and wasn't around very much. I went to a very large public high school on the southwest side of Chicago by the name of Lindblom High School. There were 5,000 students in it. About 2,500, however, were taking only a 2-year course. I got into athletics, and I was on the swimming team for a while and the track team, but concentrated on gymnastics. There was a coach there by the name of Smiddle who had winning gymnastic teams in the city of Chicago. So between academics and spending every afternoon practicing gymnastics, my time was pretty well taken up. When I was about to graduate, I was the first of my class. My father wanted me to come into the bakery business. He was ready to retire and said, "If you'll come in, Bob, and work for 2 or 3 years, I'll turn the business over to you." This was a pretty tempting proposition because it was clearing about $10,000 a year at the time, which was a lot of money.
That was a lot of money at that time.
A lot of money, and income taxes were low. But my English teacher was also my coach for my talk as valedictorian, insisted that I had such good grades that I should really think about going to college. So I decided to do that. I didn't want to go locally and build home. I didn't want to go to the University of Illinois because I'd been on the campus and it seemed kind of dull to me. My family had a summer place up in far northwestern Wisconsin, and we passed through Madison a number of times, and that campus appealed to me, so I applied there and was admitted. They were taking almost anybody who had a high school diploma at that time.
What year was that?
That was in 1929, the fall of 1929. I was in something called the Experimental College for the first 2 years. And then my father had been quite a traveler as a boy, and so had my older brother, and I sort of got the itch. And so I took a year off after the first 2 years. And I had a little money because my father, though he opposed my going to college, said, "If you insist, I'll give you a lump sum money to pay your way through college," which was $4,000. It was a lot of money in those days, but I didn't get it all because some of it was investments that turned bad. But anyway, I had a little money, so I went to Europe for a year. And then when I came back, I got into majoring in economics, a minor in political science. It was in the depths of the Depression. And economics seemed to be a field in which you might do something about it, especially because the economics department in Wisconsin at that time was very much involved in state affairs. The professors were working very closely with the state government. So I got my degree in economics in 1934, and in the spring, I applied for a teaching fellowship at Tufts in economics, and went there and was interviewed and got the job. And then a little later, there was posted on the bulletin board an announcement for a fellowship, 2-year fellowship at Harvard for training for the public service. I applied for that, got that, and turned down the Tufts job, which was a good thing. I don't think I would have been a very good teacher. I was more interested in doing things rather than teaching things. So I was there for a graduate year, and this involved a year of internship. And so I went down and I got a job as assistant to John Wynick, who was the first chairman of the Social Security Board.
That was in Washington?
In Washington,
yes.
Right. And I worked for him for a while, and I worked for the Director of Information and worked for the Director of Research. Then I was should have gone back to Harvard because they extended the fellowship for another year. But then Professor Charles McKinley had been monitoring the administration of the Social Security Act from the very beginning. He was a professor at Reed College who subsequently became president of the American Political Science Association. He had done this work for several months, interviewing the principal actors as the organization grew and problems developed. They had access to the board minutes and so on. The Social Science Research Council wanted to continue the study because McKinley had to go back to Reed, so they asked me if I would do that. So for the next year, I continued his study. And it was published many, many years later because it was so frank in its discussion of ticklish political problems that the board members did not want it published at that time, though it was essentially finished in 1940. But finally it was published by the University of Chicago Press, I think in the late 50s or early 60s. It was called Social Security Capture and Record Study. Well, I went back to Harvard for another year and passed my exams. Had nothing left but a thesis for the doctor's degree. But the Wage and Hour Act had just been passed, and I was very much interested in it, the minimum wage law. And besides, I didn't have any more money to spend while working on a dissertation. So I took the opportunity, and I was the first professional employee of the Wage and Hour Division in August of 1938. From then I went later to the Department of Agriculture, where I worked in the Secretary's office for Milton Eisenhower. Then I was in 2 war agencies, the most important of which was the War Relocation Authority, in which I was involved in an effort, a very successful effort, to get employment for the Japanese Americans who had been put into internment camps. By the end of the war, we'd gotten 45,000 out of a little known story.
How many that you got 45,000 back into the workforce?
That's
essentially.
Right. That's right.
Of what fraction of the total?
There were 110,000 total, but many of those were young children, and many were older aliens, so it was a very large proportion of the eligible workforce.
Yeah. Wow, that was very good.
And I was drafted into the Army, and I saw this coming, but my efforts to get a commission in the Army and Navy, or the Navy, didn't work because of my eyes. So I was drafted, and I had worked with some Army intelligence people, and I asked them what was the best place for me, because I was then 31 years old, and a wife and one child. For basic training, he said, Miami Beach in the Air Force. So they pulled strings, and that's where I went.
Fine.
From there, I went to the Office of Flying Safety in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, working on the analysis of aircraft accidents, and did some good there, I think. And from there, through a friend out of the blue, I got an offer to become on the staff of the Special Branch of Military Intelligence in the Pentagon, which was working not on breaking the Japanese codes, but taking the results of the Japanese code breaking, which are in many cases just bits and pieces.
Yes. What year was that?
This was in 1944.
1944.
And so we would put these bits and pieces together, whether with other information that we had, to get a picture of what was going on. The two principal sources in the code breaking were the diplomatic code of the Japanese, and the other was the Army supply code. And my particular niche was studying the shipping from the East Indies up to Japan with raw materials. And we were so good at it, we could get the convoy information in advance and set our submarines right where they were going and what time they were going. We just potted them off as they came through.
Yeah, that was very effective use of the codes.
That's right. So when the war ended, through people I'd worked with before, I became a staff member in the Office of Program Planning in the Department of Commerce. This was a sort of a brains trust of the secretary. There were several of us. We were all special assistants to the secretary. My job was the technical and scientific bureaus of the department, not involved in their technical work, but on their budgets and on their plans for legislation and things of that sort. National Bureau of Standards was one of those agencies. I worked very closely with Ed Condon when he was director of the National Bureau.
Very famous director.
That's right. Then meanwhile, I had gotten a leave of absence in a Guggenheim Fellowship. I could make a study of the international control of atomic energy. And that led me into deep trouble because I was interviewing all the principal actors in the UN Atomic Energy Commission, including the Polish member. And when I went to see him, his phone was tapped. And so I was then involved in the loyalty program because they thought I was being subversive. So it took me a year and a half to get cleared on that. And by that time, I was so fed up with the federal government that an opportunity came along to open a Washington office for the American Book Publishers Council and also to be their economist. And so I started that early in 1950. And that eventually led me into this matter of permanent paper.
Oh, yes. Well, fine. As you started in essentially the book publishing business then. What year was that again?
This was early 1951.
Early in 1951.
Right. And as a result, I was both the economist and statistician, but also their lobbyist, stationed in Washington. And so I immediately got acquainted with the people in the Washington office of the American Library Association because we had many interests in common, and also the Librarian of Congress, the Register of Copyrights, and all the chief people at the Library of Congress.
Oh, yeah. Who were some of the Library of Commerce, the Congress librarians?
When I first came in, it was Luther Evans.
Oh, yeah.
But then in 1954, he accepted the position of Secretary General of UNESCO. Bernard Clapp was his chief assistant. The title at that time was Chief Assistant Librarian. Clapp was a remarkable man who entered the Library of Congress in a very lowly position after graduating from Brown, and worked himself up to be chief assistant librarian. Very imaginative, brilliant man. He was the nominee of the American Library Association to become Librarian of Congress in 1954. But he and Luther Evans had gotten crosswise with a senator from Maryland by the name of Butler, who was a close friend of Joe McCarthy. Mm-hmm. And Butler blocked Bernard Clapp's nomination as Librarian of Congress. The man who then was nominated was Quincy Mumford, who was then director of the public library in Cleveland and had the backing of the senator from Ohio. Mumford was a good Librarian of Congress, not imaginative himself, but he had a very good staff and he supported them. And under his management, the library made very important steps forward.
Fine. Then you were starting in with your work with essentially the book publishers. What were some of your first initiatives?
Well, on the economic side, I began to look into what the Census Bureau was doing in reporting on book publishing and book manufacturing in the Census of Manufacturers. And I found that they weren't doing a very good job. And they never had the cooperation of the industry. The industry had ignored that. For example, at that time, the census grouped together retail book selling and book clubs. And these are two entirely different kinds of operations, economically and every other way. Mm-hmm. So working with the census, we got the census manufacturers improved in that respect and in other respects. I did also some economic studies on the distribution of books. I got to know the industry very well on the economic side and to some extent on the book manufacturing side. However, I never got into the paper side of the industry because that was.
Oh, yes.
I never been in a paper mill, surprisingly.
Yeah. What fraction of the book publishing business was actually directly associated with your organization? Did you have a majority of them?
Actually, there were 3 trade associations at that time. The Book Publishers Council was what is known in the business as the trade business. That's general book publishing. And then there was an earlier established organization called the Textbook Publishers Institute, which was elementary and secondary and college textbooks, but also encyclopedias. And then there was a 3rd association of university presses. When I opened the Washington office for the American Book Publishers Council, I also, many of these parts of the industry were equally interested in some Washington matters like international trade and postal rates, things of that sort. So I worked actually for both of them, and this was formalized in 1958 when I became director of the joint Washington office of the textbook and the general publishers. And then 2 years before I left, the textbook publishers and the general publishers merged into the Association of American Publishers, and I became vice president and economist then in 1970. But the permanent paper story really starts with my acquaintance with Werner Clapp. He was a member of after he was not appointed Librarian of Congress in 1954, he became the first president of a new foundation financed by the Ford Foundation called the Council on Library Resources. And this was an organization devoted to primarily technical problems of one kind or another for major research libraries. So Clapp had known about the deteriorating paper problem, of course, and when he was at the Library of Congress. And this had been well known, but the causes weren't very well known.
And how much did you say the Library of Congress is spending?
At the time, I got interested in developing legislation. Between the Library of Congress, the Council on the Humanities Endowment, and various other things, there was about $100 million being spent to preserve stuff, not to do anything about keeping the books from being on paper, which would deteriorate. So Clapp interested himself and learned about some early experiments on the cause of deterioration of paper, and then financed through the Council on Library Resources a man by the name of Barrow, who had a little laboratory connected with the Virginia State Library in Richmond. Barrow, with these funds from the Council on Library Resources, did further research and actually developed some alkaline paper. The technical side of it, as explored by Barrow and others, was that about the time of the Civil War, there was not sufficient rags to continue to meet the demand for paper, for rags. And also there was an increasing demand for books. So the turn to using wood fiber, ground up wood. And there were two processes really. One just simply ground wood, and I think that was the kind of paper mill that you worked in, wasn't it?
No, actually there were two paper mills. One was primarily book paper, and the other actually was primarily for newsprint, and that was all ground.
Yeah, that's ground wood is used for newsprint.
The other paper, the book paper, was made by the standard sulfate process.
That's right. And as I understand it, the problem was not so much with the wood pulp as the fact that they used a sizing, which is a sort of a glaze, on top of the paper to fill in the blank sort of in the process. And this sizing was alum and rosin. And I don't know about rosin, but alum is acid.
Yeah.
And it was the alum in the sizing that really resulted in the accelerated deterioration of papers made by that process.
So that with the demand for paper after the Civil War, then it was absolutely necessary to go to wood pulp.
That's right.
And from that point on.
But it wasn't necessary to go to alum, but they did. So there were several initiatives at that time to try to get publishers to use alkaline paper, which had been proven to be possible. And there was a little bit being produced, particularly by a small paper company called Glatfelter in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania. One of the earliest efforts was to develop standards for alkaline paper. They deemed permanent paper. The National Bureau of Standards had been involved in this, working with the National Historical Publications Commission, a man by the name of Wilson. And the National Historical Publications Commission did develop, a de facto standard which they required to be met for the papers they required to be used in their publications. Their publications were primarily historical documents like the complete papers of Thomas Jefferson, which they then contracted out, but they required the paper to meet these standards of theirs. That was in 1975. Then the Council on Library Resources again helped the establishment of a standard which was called the Committee on Public Production Guidelines for Book Longevity. Then I got into it a little later than that, because in 1972, I left the American Book Publishers Council, and after another government job, I became in 1978 the first director of the American National Standards Committee Z39, which was technical standards in libraries and book publishing. And so we began, I was there from 78 to almost 83. And while I was there, I got started a technical committee from the paper.
What were some of the specific standards? Can you give some examples that were in this?
Yeah, the primary thing in the standards was to give up the alum sizing and to use as filler carbonates.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a carbonate reserve of 2% in these papers. So that would be sort of a buffer.
Yeah.
And also involved in the standards was a test called accelerating aging. Mm-hmm. And so they would heat up papers to try to imitate what they thought happened with the natural aging of papers over the years.
Yeah, essentially an accelerated aging.
That's right. To imitate the natural aging just by the passage of years. And so they developed specifications that papers had to be made to meet. The first of these standards by the American National Standards Committee was in 1984, and that involved just uncoded book and writing paper. Then it wasn't until 1992 that they brought out a revised standard, but the principal revision was to include coded papers. Coded papers are used where you want to have a lot of color in the illustrations. And so as more and more colored illustrations got used in college textbooks, technical books, and things of that sort, it became important to have a standard for coded papers as well as uncoded papers. I'd like to rest for a moment here.
All right.
Go ahead.
Now we come to the story of the congressional resolution on permanent paper. In 1972, I had resigned from my position at the Association of American Publishers because I ran into some personnel difficulties with other people in the organization. And I did some other things, including, as I mentioned, this business of executive director of the American National Standards Committee, Z39, which ended in late 1982. Then I was active with the Library of Congress on some oral history, on the history of legislative activities and international activities in the book publishing and library field. So as a result of that, I went up for the confirmation hearings for James Billington when he was nominated as a Librarian of Congress to succeed Daniel Boorstin. Boorstin had succeeded Quincy Mumford. And Boorstin was an historian at the University of Chicago. Billington was also an historian, particularly on Russian history, who had been, I think, at the Woodrow Wilson Foundation at the Smithsonian. They knew each other as historians, and Boorstin got Billington nominated. So Billington didn't have any real acquaintance with the library field. He was then briefed by the staff of the Library of Congress on the pressing problems of the library to talk about in his confirmation hearings in the Senate. And Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island was in the chair, and that there was a Democrat, and he was at that time, among other things, the chairman of the Joint Committee on the Library. He knew something about the library as a result of that, but also he knew something about the acid paper problem because he had been on the board of the National Historical Publications Commission. So I went up to the hearings out of curiosity, and Billington touched on this problem that the library had of deteriorating paper and the great expense they were going to try to salvage these materials. And he also mentioned that the cause of it was the paper. And Cal said, well, can't we do something about the paper? It looks to me as if this problem is going to go on forever unless we do something about the paper. And Billington allowed this to be the case. I was sitting in the audience, and there was a Cosmos Club member up with the staff, because the Joint Committee in the library was sort of a subcommittee of another committee, and I think it was Rules of Administration of the Senate, and that was Floyd Riddick, who later became the parliamentarian of the Senate. And I had known him at the Cosmos Club. So he saw me in the audience and came up to me and said, I want to introduce you to Mr. Billington. I want to introduce you to Bill Cochran. Bill Cochran was another staff member who had particular interest in the Library of Congress. Cochran I had known before as a lobbyist on dealing with postal rates. He was a active alumnus of the University of Duke University, the University of North Carolina, and he remembered me. So after that, I thought, maybe we could have a congressional resolution on this. So I went up and talked to Cochran later, and he said, I'll help you. But then I found that I went back to my library friends. I'd been an active member of the American Library Association, and said, what kind of resolutions do you have on alkaline paper? We can't get members of Congress interested in this unless the professional associations will back them to the hilt. And I found to my surprise that there'd never been a resolution on permanent paper. I happened to be a member of a subcommittee on governmental affairs for one of the committees of the American Library Association. This was in 1987, the summer of 87, so I drafted a resolution for the American Library Association. And I couldn't get to the meeting. I think it was in Texas or something, but I got my committee to introduce the resolution, which I drafted. And they passed the resolution early in January 1988. So then I went to work on drafting a resolution for the Congress. And I drafted the resolution, and I took it to Bill Cochran, and I said, here's my draft, can you give me some help on it? And he said, yes, I certainly can. And he took it and turned it over to the bill drafting attorneys in the Senate. And then they gave me back a document which was in the format of a draft bill. For so far as the substance is concerned, it had to be a joint resolution which would be signed by the president, but on the other hand, it had to be something that was not an act, because if it was an act rather than a sort of a sentiment of the Congress, you'd have to say, how much is it going to cost? And also, if you try to impose using alkaline paper for books and documents of enduring value, then you get resistance in the government agencies and the government printing office. So we had to find some way of getting our nose under the tent. And so this was a device to a resolution which it is the policy of the United States that alkaline permanent paper should be used for books and publication and documents of enduring value.
And could you give us a summary of the amount of extra money involved if, say, in a publishing run of 10,000 books, 1,000 were on permanent paper?
At that time, it was substantial because it wasn't so much the added cost. As a matter of fact, the cost wasn't any greater, but the demand was so low that there were smaller runs, and so it wasn't stopped by paper wholesalers, and it was a sort of a special order, and also the paper manufacturers and the paper merchants treated it as a special order, and they would up their ante for it. They increased the margin that they had on it. So,
but actually, the actual manufacturing
manufacture was no more if you had the same volume.
How about pollution problems?
Well, that came along later, and I think probably, if I'm not sure of this, that Glatfelder and the others went into this because of the pollution problems. But that was massively reinforced later under the Clean Water Act and regulations of the Clean Water Act. And this meant that paper mills would have a lot of extra cost of cleaning up, keeping the water that they put back into the streams if they continued to use the alkaline paper process. And so they began to shift over to the alkaline process.
Which was less polluting.
Yes, yeah. They would not have those massive costs of trying to overcome the pollution problem.
So that actually the stricter pollution standards helped that situation.
Very much. That's right. And once they made the transfer, actually the process was somewhat cheaper because they could use a lot of carbonates as filler, and these were quite cheap. So, where were we? We had the resolution, and we got a professional bill drafted, and then I had to find somebody to introduce it. And by that time, it's been 20 years since I've been an active lobbyist, and I lost my personal contacts. So one day when I was having lunch at the Cosmos Club with a man by the name of Theodore Waller, who had been a colleague of mine in the American Book Publishers Council. I told him what I was up to, and he at that time was the executive director of the Senate, the Democratic Re-election Committee. Through a friend of his, Alan Cranston, who was then senator from California. So I was asking Ted, and here I am, I got this bill, who I get to sponsor it. And he said, Claiborne Pell's your man, and I'm on very good terms with his executive assistant. So then and there, from the Cosmos Club, he called this executive assistant and set up an appointment for me, not with him, but with the legislative assistant for Senator Pell, a man by name who had been with him for many years, a man by name of Orlando Potter. So I made an appointment with Orlando Potter, and he began telling me about a study which had recently been made by the Office of Technological Assessment of the Senate on paper, which had said that only about 10 or 15% of the paper then being book paper was then being manufactured was alkaline, and the report said there's not much prospect of it increasing. So Orlando Potter brought this thing out and was going to educate me about this. And I said, I know about the report, but I have a bill here I want you to send it to the draft. And so I handed it to him, and he said, this is an internal Senate document. How did you get hold of this stuff? I said, well, at the moment, I'm not free to tell you, because I didn't want to embarrass Bill Cochran. But I went to Bill Cochran later, and he said, this is perfectly all right. And so the origin became known. So Potter said, I think the senator would be interested in this. So he sent it over to the Library of Congress and said, what do you think about this? If the senator introduces it, you back it. And the Library of Congress said, no, sure we will. And the Library Association has already gone on record, and we can get a lot of support for it. So Pell introduced the bill in October of 1988. And this was just before the end of that 2-year session of the Congress. Then, early in 1989, there was a meeting of either the Executive Committee or maybe, I think it was the Executive Council of the American Library Association. And I drafted a resolution for them endorsing the Pell bill. And Orlando Potter appeared before their legislative committee, explaining it and getting their support. And though it was totally unnecessary, he told them that I had drafted the bill, which was very generous of him. That's frequently not done by members of Congress and their staff. So then the bill was reintroduced in February of 1989 as the February 8, 1989, that's right. And this time, Pell had rounded, and his staff had rounded up 19 co-sponsors in the Senate. Mostly Democrats, but quite a few Republicans. Pell was a very senior senator. He'd been there a long time. and a lot of friends on both sides of the aisle. Going back to the resolution and content, though, really the biting part of it was this resolution, and it's the policy of the United States to use acid-free permanent paper in books and documents of enduring value. But there were some other things in there, which I put in, recommending to private publishers that they do this too, recommending to state and local governments that they do this too, recommending to international agencies that they promote this idea as well. Also, there was a while they'd have to report back to the Congress is what they were doing. They just couldn't sit on it.
Fine. Well, with regard to the types of paper which would be covered by this, of course, in the last 25 years, there's been a great growth in the use of Xerox paper, for instance.
Right.
And also now computer paper and so forth. Now, what is the status of those two kinds of paper, and how would they be affected by these resolutions?
Actually, once you've got an alkaline mill, you produce that any kind of paper on it, as long as they have ground wood. Mm-hmm. And so they will turn out xerographic paper, computer paper, all kinds of paper. Yeah. That's the same process.
Mm-hmm. But there's been, of course, an increasing amount of documents, perhaps very important ones, that would be in the field of Xerox or computer paper. And so this could be an important factor in the
operation. Mm-hmm. There's another kind of salvage operation which involves taking the deteriorating paper and getting carbonates into it.
Oh, yes.
That's a very expensive process too. Mm-hmm. And the other way of doing it, other than microfilming, is to make a Xerox copy, putting it on alkaline paper.
Yeah.
So that's an important part of the salvage process.
Oh, yes.
But microfilming and Xeroxing, or xerographic copying, is labor intensive, and so it's quite expensive, and much more expensive. Much better to try to preserve the original paper, then you don't have any more labor costs on it.
Okay.
So getting back to the story, things went along very well in 1989, and by the summer of '89, we got the bill passed by the Senate with 46 co-sponsors. It never went to a committee. It just brought up on the floor by agreement or unanimous consent. And this process involves the Democratic leader and the Republican leader conferring, and they both agree that their parties will support this. And so it passed by unanimous consent in July of 1989.
Well, that was a very successful project in getting that.
That's right.
It was amazing to get that through.
Then we had to go to the House, and we didn't have an obvious sponsor there, like Pell. And our library allies in the associations had their greatest contact in the House committees was in the House Committee on Education and Labor, especially the Education Subcommittee. So they picked a principal sponsor there by name of Pat Williams from Montana. And he had introduced a companion bill to the Senate Pell bill in March of 1989. But then we had some bad luck in getting it assigned to committee. I had anticipated this problem and went to a woman by name of Adarine McCormick, who was then the congressional liaison person for the Librarian of Congress, and had been for several years, and I'd worked with her on other matters. And she called up to the parliamentarian's office, because he's the one that advises the chair in the House as to which committee a bill is to go to. But there was a slip-up there, and it got assigned to two committees. And that's always bad news, because they have to agree and who's first, and it's a big delay. It's really bad news.
In other words, there wasn't any opposition to the idea. It's just a question
It
of
was,
politics.
it was completely ignorance and lack of interest and somebody pushing it.
Yes.
So I went to the Committee on House Administration, and then went to the Committee on Governmental Affairs, and the subcommittee of the Committee on Governmental Affairs, headed by a congressman from West Virginia by the name of Wise. And the principal sponsor, Pat Williams, wasn't on either of these committees or subcommittees, so that was bad news in itself. So eventually we got the House Committee on Administration to give up jurisdiction and pass it over to the Subcommittee on Government Operations of the Committee on Government Operations. Then we ran into some other bad news. The staff member for the subcommittee was pushing another bill on paperwork reduction. And the American Library Association had opposed his draft of that bill. It had other ideas. And so he wasn't favorably disposed to anything that the American Library Association was pushing. But finally, he agreed to hearings, which occurred in early 1990 before the subcommittee. But he didn't even invite the American Library Association to testify in the hearings.
That's amazing.
That's right. But that shows what importance some staff members can frequently have. But that was such vindictiveness I had never run into before. So the Librarian of Congress appeared, and the book publishers appeared, and the research libraries appeared, and the archivist appeared, and so on, but not the American Library Association. But anyway, he then tinkered with the bill, and one other things, he limited the number of progress reports that were to be made to 3, ending in 1995. I had a little more open-ended thing in there. So then there was a delay because the subcommittee doesn't meet very often, and the full committee doesn't meet very often, but finally we got through that process. And somewhere very late in that session, that 2-year session of the Congress was going to end in October of 1990 because there was an election year, congressional elections. And finally, we got passage in the House on September 2017. We had a month or so to go, and it was a different bill. And then we got it through quickly in the House, though, by a similar device. There's a device in there are 2 devices in the House to get through uncontroversial bills that have gone through committee. One is called unanimous consent, in which they think nobody's going to object. And then there is suspension of the rules. And suspension of the rules means that you have to get a 2/3 vote. So the minority speaker and the minority leader were consulted in the House, and they consulted with the committees, and they agreed that there wasn't going to be any significant opposition. So it got put on the suspension of the rules calendar and went through without opposition vote. But then when we got over to the Senate, we missed the opportunity, and I'm not quite sure. I was certainly responsible, and other people too. We didn't get somebody on the floor at the time that the bill came over as passed the House to say it's going to go immediately to the Senate floor. Instead, it got sent to a committee, the Committee on Government Operations. And the ALA and the other library association and I were beating on that committee, and we just couldn't get the chairman to do something about it. He had other fish to fry. So at the last minute, we found that there was another device. Even if it gotten referred to committee, if the majority leader and the minority leader agreed, it could be brought up on the Senate floor. And that was what it was done. With its 47 sponsors and nobody opposing, we squeezed it through in the closing days of that Congress. If we hadn't done that, it would have had been to reintroduce the next year as a separate bill and go through this whole process once more.
Right. Well, fine. And that's a real insight into how Congress works and how a bill gets passed and not passed.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's my 20 years of experience on the Hill. I was one of the very few people that knew all parts of this operation.
It's very important.
The bill was then signed by President Bush on October 12, 1990, as Public Law 101-423. The first report then was made pursuant to this requirement that the report be made to the Congress on December 31, 1992. And it wasn't much of a report. It had just been a little over a year. And there was an acting archivist, and so there wasn't very much activity on the part of the archivist of the United States.
Was it his responsibility to give the report?
Well, it was a joint report of the archivist, the Librarian of Congress, and the public printer. And we had a little difficulty. The report was sent over, and then it got lost. And finally, I found it with the help of Bill Cochran, and I got it printed as a Senate committee print. Then there was another report in December 31, 1994. And the same thing happened again. It got lost. And I rescued it once more and got it out as a committee print. And then in 1994, there was this scare with respect to recycling paper, using recycled paper for government use. And there was an old recommendation of EPA that set forth a standard of using 10% to start with of recycled paper for government documents and government publications. And then this was taken up, being considered, and was finally passed as an executive order by President Clinton in 1994. Now, there are two kinds of paper that's used in recycling, book paper. One is taking the scraps from the paper mill and the scraps from the book printing process, which have never been printed on, and putting them back into the mix. And then there's something, and that's easy. But then there's something like, it's called post-consumer waste. And that's stuff that's gone into documents and Xerox paper and everything else, and frequently mixed up with a lot of other junk, including plastics. And so that presents a much bigger problem of putting it back into the paper making process, because some of that junk will foul up the paper making machines. So there was nothing said in the executive order about Public Law 101423 in the policy of the United States, so which took precedence here. So all of us were very worried about this. And we lobbied the White House to get something into the executive order that mentioned that the agencies would have a choice if they had to use permanent paper for their purposes. They didn't get bound by this recycled paper operation. So we ran into a dead end with another staff member in this White House who just wouldn't give us the time of day. We went then by a back door again, and Senator Moynihan, the director of the New York Public Library, went to Senator Moynihan, and he wrote to the director of EPA and said, "What about this? Shouldn't you give priority to permanent paper when it's required?" And so he wrote a letter back to the senator and said, "There's no conflict whatsoever. We're in back of permanent paper, and if it's needed, the agency should use it." So that crisis got right.
It shows what complications are unforeseen.
That's
here.
Right. We now move to the implementation, not only in the federal government, but more importantly in the private sector. Government produces documents to some extent, publications, but the big producers of books and journals and so on, paper, are private publishers, profit and non-profit. This whole thing was in the air, and so a lot of initiatives were going on about the time I got into it, which I didn't know about, and they didn't know about what each other were doing. One of them was a woman author who got interested, a member of the Authors League, and got interested in this, got the Authors League interested, got the New York Public Library interested. And so her name is Barbara Goldsmith. And so she put on a big campaign through the New York Public Library to get book publishers in New York, which is sort of the center of book publishing, to take a pledge to use alkaline paper. And she was quite successful, and some of the prominent publishers took the pledge, and the Association of American Publishers endorsed the idea. And there's a big ad in the New York Times. This was in the spring of 1989, about the time after I'd gotten started on this. The pledge was all very good, but the implementation wasn't very good, because the volume of alkaline paper was not all that great, and the publishers did not were willing to make an effort to put the first editions of many books on alkaline paper, but they weren't willing to make the commitment, not the first printings, because they might have to do the first printings in a hurry, and they wanted to be able to use whatever paper was available, not to wait till they could get alkaline paper. So they would not commit themselves to carrying through on subsequent printings of alkaline paper, which the university publishers were quite willing to do because subsequent printings were not all that common, and also university press publishers sold a very high proportion of their books to libraries. About the same time, there was another initiative, unknown to me until it was well underway, by the director of the National Library of Medicine. The National Library of Medicine runs an operation called, shall we stop for a moment?
Yeah. All right.
The National Library of Medicine runs an operation called the Index Medicus. And this is an index and a summary of what appears in the biomedical literature worldwide. And there are some 3,000 technical journals in the Index Medicus. And he got interested in this permanent papers thing and figured out how he could use this Index Medicus as a lever. And so he got the endorsement of his trustees to go ahead, and the support of the chairman of his appropriation subcommittee, and started a campaign. And when they started, there were very few journals on alkaline paper.
When was this that they started? Mm-hmm. What year?
They started in 1986. And by 1995, they got the vast majority of biomedical journals throughout the world on alkaline paper. And this was a lead-in, of course, to get activities done in Europe, because some of these big international publishers were European publishers, and in books as well as journals. Then there were two sort of important initiatives. The Association of Research Libraries, which is an association of about 105 research libraries in the United States and Canada, which have the vast bulk of the important historical and research documents, publications, put out a portfolio, which I'll show you, called, did that show up well enough?
Well, it doesn't, I can't read the...
You see it now?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's still very good.
Wait, just a minute. Just keep holding. There we
Preserving knowledge, the case for alchemy.
Good.
Okay, this portfolio was in a collection of documents, including this came out in the spring of '89, which included the Pell Bill, the Pell remarks when he introduced the bill in the Senate, some material from the state of Connecticut, some technical material, the standards, and so on.
In other words, to make the alkaline paper available, they really had to build new plants. The paper.
Well, mostly convert old plants. It was the same old plant, they just converted to process. And in this portfolio, there is actually a long account by a paper mill operator who explains how he did it. It was mostly a process of cleaning out the acid from the whole mill, so there wasn't any contamination left in there, and then starting over again.
But the incentives to do it were apparently missing early on, and
That's right.
They had to build up from the book publishing.
It was the incentive of more demand, plus this very important incentive of meeting the anti-pollution requirements.
Yeah.
And once
that was an amazing
that's right.
bonus.
Yeah, really amazing coincidence there.
It could easily have gone the other way.
That's right.
In which case it would have delayed it.
That's right, a lot. That's right. Then there was a very persuasive film brought out in 1987 called Slow Fires. This was an educational film about deterioration of paper in books and documents and libraries. It's brought out by the Commission on Preservation and Access. This was another foundation-started operation sometime before 1987. I don't know how long, I can't remember how long. But though its primary purpose, however, was the salvaging of existing materials. They took account of the problem of getting alkaline paper produced and used, but their major effort didn't go into it. But the film was a very important document, was shown widely in this country, including on the Hill and in Europe. And then there was another very important player in this game, a remarkable woman by name of Ellen McCready. She started out as a bookbinder in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, I think. She had nothing more than a high school education. She then began to put out a newsletter on bookbinding, and then got interested in the permanent paper problem and started putting stuff in there as well. She moved her operations to New York City, and there she put out this newsletter. This is a one-woman operation. She would use a push cart on the streets of New York to move the paper from the paper merchant to the printer.
Amazing story. Really dedicated.
Oh, really. So then she, this first publication was called the Abbey Newsletter. And there was some reason in Michigan that was the reason. Then she moved her operations to Salt Lake City, but it was still a one-man operation. But she became entirely familiar with the whole technical process. Just self-taught, but she really was marvelous. So she was the one organ in the library field, both in this country and abroad, that was concentrated not only on the preservation problem, but the preventive preservation problem. So she immediately gave publicity to all of these developments. Then at a later stage, she moved her operation to Austin, Texas, and she set up a parallel, another newsletter specifically on permanent paper, which was called the Alkaline Paper Advocate. And this was devoted entirely to that subject, whereas the Abbey newsletter, which continued, only had the principal developments on alkaline paper, and so they were running in tandem. So we got to be very cooperative in many efforts. And I think those were the principal sort of parallel papers in this operation, in this gestation period. We all got very well acquainted, but we started independently. Then there is the matter of state activity, state and local government activity. The state librarian of Connecticut got started very early on this, just about as early as I did, in 1987. He got a resolution in the legislature of the state of Connecticut in 1987 endorsing a study, and then came back with the report of the study in 1989, and the state of Connecticut then passed its first act to start using permanent paper in state and local publications. And this was not a sweeping act at the first place, but they acted on it year by year and improved it so that at the end it was the most comprehensive of any state legislation. There were other bits and pieces of state legislation around also that here dealt with judicial documents, or here was some kind of documents, but nothing very comprehensive. But there was something in a dozen states. Some of them insisted on using rag paper, for example, just as that in the early days there was a special edition of the library of the congressional record on rag paper for preservation purposes. So I got
at the present time is the congressional record
on permanent
paper.
So I got interested in the state activity too. I was up at a reception at the Library of Congress of the National Commission on Libraries and Information Science, which had been established as an independent commission sometime in the 80s. I got to talking with this was a commission with a permanent executive director and a small staff, but commission members who were just part-time, they had other jobs. And I got talking at that reception with the chairman, who was a man from New Jersey, who was, among other things, a very active public library trustee. I'd gotten used to doing business at cocktail parties as a lobbyist. That was frequently a good way to do business. And so I got hold of this fellow and said, how about the National Commission getting interested in this? One of your pieces of jurisdiction is to promote library activity in state and local governments. He said, one of his staff members, he said, talk to Mary Alice and prepare something with me, and I'll do something about it. So I developed a letter to the state governors from the chairman of the commission, attaching a copy of the federal legislation and asking whether they were doing anything in this field, and sent a copy to the state librarian. This first survey went out in 1991, and we got quite a few responses to it. And I summarized the responses, and it was put in the congressional record, my summary by Senator Pell. Then we did another one in 1992. The responses were not nearly as good. And by then, the chairman of the commission was a Nixon appointee. He was a Republican. The first chairman was a Republican too, but not very partisan. But the second chairman was not really interested in the commission and its work. And the commission got bloated down with political appointees as commissioners who didn't really have any interest in the work. This was just sort of an honorary thing for them. So the whole thing sort of broke down, and it wasn't until 1995 that we had a third survey, and this was jointly with the Librarian of Congress, sent out the third progress report, but we got very little responses from the governors. I think by that time there was so much anti-Washington feeling that the governors weren't going to pay any attention to letters from a commission whose chairman was the wife of Senator Simon of Illinois. But we got some results out of this survey, and I can't really trace how many results, but I do know of some. And that goes on to my own experience with state legislation. Patricia Berger, who was the librarian of the National Bureau of Standards, when I had my office there as executive director of American National Standards Committee Z39, and I was a guest worker at the National Bureau of Standards, was by then a member or maybe even chairman of the advisory council of the State Library of Virginia. And she knew about my efforts, and she got an inquiry. She lived in Alexandria and was active in Democratic politics there. She got an inquiry from a member of the Virginia House of Delegates who in Alexandria who had heard about this problem in some committee that she was on, and turned to Pat Berger and said, "Can I do anything?" And Pat Berger says, "I'll turn you over to Bob Frase." And so I met with her, and she has sort of explained the ground rules and the situation in the state legislature, which I had very little contact around. What little I had was very unhappy. She said, probably the best way to approach this is for me to introduce a study resolution, to ask the state librarian to report on the problem and make some recommendations. And this was sort of on the Connecticut pattern. So she passed the study resolution. It went to the state librarian, who was then a woman, was a librarian. And she turned me over to one of her staff, who was sort of a political appointee and not very savvy. And we didn't really get very far in drafting a bill for the state legislature, but finally got out of her hands into the hands of the state archivist. The state library is, the state archives is a subdivision of the state library. So then things picked up, and we drafted a decent bill that got introduced in the next session, and it was passed. It was not much trouble. And it's been implemented, but the problem is that it was primarily building on a previous bill, and so it dealt with the judicial documents of state and local governments and not too much other kinds of documents and publications, so that followed the law.
But it still was
still
a requirement
yeah,
that,
still for judicial documents.
to be on permanent
That's
basis.
right.
And that was just for the state of Connecticut.
Yeah. No, this is for the state of Virginia.
Virginia. Right.
Then my own other personal experience, another personal experience I had was in the state of Wisconsin. I was a graduate of the university and was active in a kind of a sub-alumni association there, and still am. And I'll pause for a minute. I think I'm going to use your facilities too.
All right, fine, very good.
Okay.
Another thing about Werner Clapp and the Cosmos Club, I mentioned Ted Waller being a member, and the parliamentarian of the library, Riddick being a member and later president. Werner Clapp was a member too, and he had his office when he was at the library, at the Council on Library Resources in the DuPont Circle building, and we used to have lunch quite often, and after lunch we played billiards.
Yes.
So there's a lot of connection with the Cosmos Club.
Yes.
Okay, back to the state of Wisconsin. So I was out there for a meeting and consulted with people, and they put me in touch with the Democratic leader of the Senate. He was on the board of something called the Wisconsin Center for the Book. There is a National Center for the Book at the Library of Congress, established by legislation promoted by Daniel Boorstin, which is in the business of promoting books and reading. And subsequently, there were various state centers set up. I'm a member of the board of the Virginia Center, for example. Some of them are active and some are not. But anyway, the Democratic Senate leader in the legislature of Wisconsin was a member of the Center for the Book in Wisconsin. So I worked with him. We never got anywhere in that. But what did happen was that Governor Thompson, who was governor then, now become much more prominent, took this letter from the chairman of the National Commission, and his staff sent it around to various government agencies which were involved. And I've tried to follow it, but it ground through that process in several agencies. Nobody is, government officials are not apt to want to change the way they're doing things. It's just too much trouble. But finally, they got together and made a recommend. They checked with the paper companies, since they were very important in Wisconsin. And they finally got around to doing by administrative action of using permanent paper in the state government of Wisconsin.
Well, that worked out fine.
That's right. Another experience was in Minnesota. Our son Richard is a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School. So he knew what I was up to. And we were out there one time talking about it, and I said, anyway, you have contacts to get this started in Minnesota. He said, yes, there is a friend of mine who's a part-time professor at the law school who is in the state legislature. So I never met the man, but I sent him all this stuff and prepared something. I never been able to get the librarians organized in Minnesota. So he introduced a bill, and this covered not only the state government, but local governments as well. And they had hearings, or I don't know whether they had hearings or this, it just exploded with the organizations involved. And the Association of County Governments opposed it, because they didn't want the state telling them what to do. And we still don't have a bill in Minnesota.
Well, that often happens with different governmental organizations. They preserve their turf.
Now, the third thing is California. And I did not have an active role in that, but I know something about it. And it's sort of startling in a way, and something that's unique as far as I know. The state librarian got interested in it, a man by the name Strong. And after the fact, I met him at a reception at the Library of Congress. And I said, how are you doing on your permanent paper bill? He said, we passed it. And the governor vetoed it because a friend of his, financial supporter of his, ran a paper mill that produced acid paper.
End of subject.
That's a rather direct connection.
That's right.
Was that Governor Wilson?
Yeah.
Pete Wilson.
The state librarians and state archivists were either not, my experience, and I libraried them quite a bit because I knew a lot of them, always had something more important to do, budgets and various other things, and they never really got behind it. The state of New York, for example, they've had bills in that state legislature for 10 years now. They've never got it passed.
Well, don't you suppose it's because they sort of secretly think that the CD-ROMs are going to take it over and the microfilms, and that's the way it will remain. I think that's all mistaken, you understand?
No, I don't think so. I think they're sophisticated enough to know that the documents are going to be around for a long time. And as a matter of fact, permanent paper is the most long-lasting of any material you now have, because all of this other stuff has got plastic in it, and it has to be redone.
Except for clay.
That's right.
Except for clay.
That's right.
Yeah. And stone.
Yeah.
Okay. I got a list of the states that did something finally. We can put in here if you like. There are 27. I don't know whether that's relevant or not. The last one I might say a word about, it just came out of the blue last year, or this year. I got to be known in this field as somebody to talk to. And so I would get calls from people in the States that wanted to promote something. So I got a call last fall, I think, last year, from a preservation librarian in the library at the University of Utah. And he said, I got your name, we want to do something, can you help me? So I made him a big package of stuff and sent it out there. And then I didn't hear anymore until out of the blue this year, I think it was this year, he sent me the state law.
Oh, how nice. They did it all by themselves.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, that sometimes is, I've had some experience with that. If you just get it in the right package at the right time with the right person, it just automatically takes place.
Speaking of your package, is it possible to obtain copies of that brochure that you showed in front of the camera?
Oh, yes, by all means.
And where is it available?
I got an extra copy. I did the whole thing.
That'd be fine.
Yes.
Got to put it in my box at the Cosmos Club, and I'll pick it up.
Yeah, good. Okay, now go to the international field. I have been an active member of the American Library Association for many years. And then back, 15 or 20 years ago, I got to going to some conference of the International Federation of Library Associations. Not on this subject at all, but on library statistics. I had briefly, while I was an economic consultant, headed a project on library statistics for the American Library Association. And I got involved with UNESCO's recommendation on library statistics as a consultant to them. So I started going to IFLA meetings. We went to one in Denmark, another one in Czechoslovakia on library statistics. Then in 1989, there was a biannual conference of IFLA in Paris. And so I got myself, I just went. Anybody who was member of the American Library Association could go. But beforehand, I went to a woman by the name of Marilee Smith, who was in the preservation business on the staff of the Library of Congress, and was also, at that time, had some kind of a position on preservation for a committee of IFLA, all the conservation committee. So I went to her, said I'd like to get a resolution through at the IFLA conference in Paris in August of '89. He said, if you draw up a resolution, I'll endorse it and we'll send it to the chairman of the Conservation Committee of IFLA and see if he will back it at the IFLA meeting. So I did that, and he said he would agree, and we introduced it at the committee meeting. I testified on it in the committee, and we got it passed as a professional resolution. It was the first one that IFLA had ever done on permanent paper. Surprisingly enough.
That's
right.
Yeah, international.
Yeah. While I was in Paris at the time, I thought I could get something going with UNESCO, because it was natural for UNESCO to take up. And through a friend who had been, at one time, not too far earlier, been Deputy Director General of UNESCO, John Forbes, I got an introduction to somebody on the Director General's staff. And I had a resolution I hoped to get passed by the UNESCO General Conference in November that year. And he received me very cordially, but I didn't have much time. I had to go back. And I didn't get to see the people in the Secretariat concerned with library matters. And they took a very dim view of it. And they have to this day.
Why is that?
For two, I just surmise this, but it's a good surmise. First, well, three things. One, it was a not invented here syndrome. We didn't invent this thing. Two, the United States and Great Britain were no longer members of UNESCO. And so we had no internal clout. And three, UNESCO was very much concerned with the developing countries who have a majority in the UN. And this was a matter that, logically concerned the developing countries, because all of their paper had been on just junk. But some of their delegates took the position, if we endorse permanent paper and we don't make it, then we were being discriminated against. So there was a combination of factors. The UNESCO resolution, the IFLA resolution, as a matter of fact, made a big point of asking UNESCO not to do anything to start with, but just to make a survey, a UNESCO survey of how much the permanent paper was being used. But even that wasn't acceptable to them. So that flopped. And then in 1991, there was another general conference in UNESCO that I wanted to go to for a variety of reasons. This was in Moscow. And I had been involved with professional matters for many years, starting with the fact that I spent a month in Russia when I was knocking about Europe in 1931. And in 1947, 46 had been director of the UNESCO mission in Russia for several months, and had been in two book publishers' conferences in Russia. So I wanted to go. I was an old Russian hand, and my wife had never been there, so I wanted to take her along. So I went to the IFLA conference, and she came along. And right in the middle of it was the coup attempt, when they had captured
that was a
Prime
very
Minister.
troubled time.
That's right. And there was this assault on the White Tower, the Parliament building. Eleanor actually was in the Kremlin just as a sightseer the day the tanks were on the street, and her bus had trouble getting back to her hotel with the tanks on the street of Moscow.
That was an exciting time.
That's right. We were in a hotel not too close to where the conference was in the center of Moscow, but actually nothing much was going on except in that center of Moscow, and the people in the rest of the city were just going about their business in the ordinary way. So I got the resolution through, sponsored by the American delegation and the British delegation. But the last day when the resolutions were passed, got canceled because of the confusion there. And so they actually got passed at the conference. But then they had a process of sending them out to the membership later and getting them endorsed that way. And a couple of years later, the resolution got passed. And this again stressed UNESCO getting into the act. And then we had negotiations with UNESCO by Bob Wedgeworth, who was had gotten, after being executive director of the American Library Association, had gotten to be the president of IFLA for 2-year term. But still, we got nowhere. And to finish that story, and if I was at the General Conference, RA Conference of UNESCO, of IFLA in Cuba in August, 2 or 3 summers ago, and got involved again with the preservation people, and especially the Canadians, who were then willing to get an effort, since they couldn't get cooperation from the staff, to get various national delegations of UNESCO to raise the question at a general conference. And they were well on their way to doing that, but then the UNESCO secretariat people persuaded them that they would at long last take the initiative, and they didn't have to do it that way. So that's where it stands at the moment.
Very interesting.
But also on UNESCO, IFLA, I got at the Moscow conference, after the second resolution was passed, I talked to the editor of the IFLA bulletin. I think that's the name, but I have copies of it, I'll let you know. I said, you ought to have an article on permanent paper. So I did one, the first article I ever had, 1991 issue of IFLA Journal, that's the name of it. And then I did another one, as it was called Permanent Paper, a Progress Report. And then I did another one in 1995, called Permanent Paper, Progress Report number 2. Also on the